Sorry to interrupt. You're muted.
I'm glad you did interrupt. Thank you so much. Never hesitate.
Oh, good. I know that it's not, well, you actually said all the important stuff probably in the first 5 minutes, so.
That's it. Now you can leave. Yeah. We missed the opening prayer is, so I'm pointing out as we begin this or continue this conversation about the Christian concept of war, that just a few days ago on the 4th of May, the Pope had a telephone conversation with the Orthodox leader, Patriarch Kirill. And the article I read said that the Pope sat on the phone for nearly the entire time, listening to the Patriarch repeat one after the other all of the reasons why this war is justified. And the Pope's response was, brother, you are speaking the language of politics, and we are called to speak the language of Jesus. And he acknowledged that the Patriarch has become an arm of the state, and expressed that, I bring great delight in this, you know what type of person I am, expressed it by saying, you have become Putin's altar boy. He said,
Of course, the papacy does not have clean
no,
hands.
exactly, of course, absolutely, just as all human beings. However, we can, for this Pope, acknowledge his perspective on what is going on here. That as followers of Jesus, we are devoted first to our faith, not to the state. And this is one concept that I think is extremely, just that basic concept is extremely important for all of us to understand. It doesn't mean we can run from the state. It doesn't mean that we can unentangle ourselves from the state, as some Christian sects have tried to do without much success. But nevertheless, the leaders of the church are not, one way to say it, are not to allow the state to overtake the church. There is a difference. There is a difference. So this is a timely conversation. It's always timely, as our diplomat can tell you. And I'm so glad that I am, Liz's expertise in diplomacy is part of this, because as we're going to see, if war is not the answer, if pacifism, which we'll get to, is not the answer, then we have to look toward what is exactly might be described as diplomacy. As diplomacy.
That's what I said yesterday at Warren Wilson too, came last week.
Amen. Amen. So let's step back for a moment and just have a general conversation of Christian kind of perspective on, you can call it war, but it's also kind of defending oneself. How does one defend oneself? What are the parameters? Are we allowed to defend ourselves under any conditions and in any way, right? So you can start from the personal. And this is important to start from the personal because what you believe about the personal projects out to what you might believe about nations. Not the same, but there is a relationship because one, well, I guess you can, but it's hard in a logical sense to hold that you have permission to use violence to protect oneself, but that a nation may not have permission to use violence to protect itself. So they're related. If I believe that if I'm confronted on the street and I have the means to protect myself, but protecting myself may hurt the other person. If I believe that's okay, because I'm protecting myself, the other person may be harmed, the other person may be killed, but I protected myself. If that's okay, then it's hard to assert that a nation can't do the same. So you can see how you can start with myself. What would I do about myself? What do I believe about myself and obviously about my family, right? Because that's a part of it as well. Let's look a little bit at the differing, I guess I would use the word arguments, but they're really perspectives about how we should understand this concept of, we're calling it war, but it's also the concept of defense and as well. So there's a couple of different ways that Christians through the centuries have approached war and peace, if you will. There have been those who we might call as pacifists. Right? Then there are those who sees war as a great and mighty way, a good option for dealing with the problems of the world, right? That it's okay to start there, right? There could be that perspective. And then there can be the perspective of what is called, it's okay to enforce peace. That violence is okay to bring peace to a situation that already is violent. So you have a couple of different perspectives from Christians on war, and every single perspective has, surprise, surprise, every single perspective has biblical passages that they go to to support themselves. And yet there are traditions. There are traditions just in theology as much as in anything else. I want to look a little bit at the history of Christianity as well, right? It's remember that Christianity did not become the religion of the state until the mid-300s. So 300 years of Christian witness and life happened before Christianity became the religion of the state. And in those early years, the evidence that we have does suggest that most Christians were pacifists, that they were really saw the gospel of Jesus as a gospel of peace and were to be people of peace. You can think of although we know now that many of these stories have been exaggerated, although it is true that Christians were persecuted before in Rome, before in other places, before it became the religion of the state. The great, symbol and image of a Christian martyr, someone who, even though they could have defended themselves, they did not defend themselves and gave their life up for the good, if you will, right? So there are tons of images in the lives of the saints where the saint did not defend themselves and allowed themselves to be killed as a statement of the way of Jesus, if you will, right? So, but then what happened is that Christianity became the religion of the state, right? And just on the pages of the newspaper in 2022, the church and the state were mixed up and wrapped up with one another. And then, of course, in Rome, all of a sudden, barbarians attack, right? And the question is, do we defend ourselves? Do we fight against this? And obviously, the answer was yes. Right? And so there began to be developed within what is called the fathers of the church, because not most of the ones recorded, but many of the early theologians of the church were, of course, men. And so that's a phrase that is used to go back and study Christian theology and its progression and history. And writers started to write about the perspective of war. So St. Augustine, for example, writes about this, and he writes about it in the sense of it's okay for the state to enforce peace, to bring about peace, right? So violence is permitted if the goal of the state is to bring about peace. And there's one level at which we, well, I don't know, I can't speak for anyone else. There's one level at which one might think, well, this is reasonable. And so at one level, I hope that as we're having this class, you're thinking to yourself, I wonder what I believe. And you might know already, but nevertheless, I wonder what I believe, right? And I can imagine many of us thinking to ourselves, well, it's okay to defend people. It's okay to bring peace, if you will. I can imagine many of us, as a matter of fact, I would venture to guess that most of the Episcopal Church falls into at least this type of category, right? However, we know from the life of St. Augustine and his writings that for him, and maybe it's just a factor of the time, right? We want to think of human beings primarily as civilized, so to say, but there were many generations in the past where the definition of civilized was different, right? So Augustine, for example, thought it was okay to do violence and murder and kill many of, well, for example, the Donatists, people who thought differently than him on the nature of Jesus. And that was kind of a defensive posture, he thought. We can't allow these people to corrupt the church. We may not have included that in today's category of what is civilized. So even there, the question of what is permitted is different, right? And then later on, we begin to get a much more sophisticated kind of ordering of the Christian perspective of war. Thomas Aquinas in the 1200s wrote about this in detail. And he started to write out kind of expectations of what it would take for someone to be able to say that this was a situation in which one could defend oneself. So he starts to get specific about the guidelines that someone has to go through to then come to the conclusion that it's okay to use violence to defend oneself, right? And of course, writing in the 1200s, a number of his tests, if you will, are, it has to come through the authority of the sovereign. So of course, there are no mainly democratic nation states at the time, right? Has to come through the authority of the sovereign, and it has to be a just cause. How do you define that? We'll talk about that eventually. Has to be a just cause. And the state has to have the right intention. Right? The right intention. But think about this. We today have internationally and nationally concepts around this that somehow we are outraged, and of course should be, right? That Russia is indiscriminately targeting civilians, right? So one might say in this case that their intention is wrong, right? That their intention is wrong. One might say in this case, their other intention is to take over another country from the start, so to say. Now, we have to just posit that they have a long argument about why Ukraine is not really another country, but they have to have that argument. Or they really are just indiscriminately taking over another country, right? Which somehow breaks a test even for them, right? Somehow breaks a test even for them. And to him, the only goal of war would be to secure peace, right? So if the goal was to take back lands or get oil fields to protect, because your oil fields were running out or something like this, then that would not pass the test, so to say.
This is Aquinas?
This is Aquinas, yeah. And then we get the Protestant Reformation, where generally the Protestant reformers kind of, in one way or another, agreed with Aquinas that there was justice in the state defending itself and securing peace. And of course, there would have been no Protestant Reformation if the Protestant reformers were not defended by the state. Martin Luther was defended by the princes around him. John Calvin was defended by the princes around him. And of course, we would not have had the Anglican Reformation, Protestant Reformation, if it had not been that the sovereign became the leader of the state, right? Another example of the mixing of church and state, which many are often surprised by the fact that that is true even to this day in the United Kingdom. There is no separation of church and state. Now, it may operate that way, but there is no separation of church and state. There are some of the guidelines for how Christians have seen war. Questions, comments? Yeah. Jason.
One of the other provisions for the definition of a just war is proportionality.
Right, yes, there is a more detailed means test, if you will, in modern ideas just war theory. Absolutely. So proportionality is one
Which
of.
raised the question of Putin's threat to use tactical nukes.
That's correct. Yeah.
And this is upping the ante.
Exactly. So proportionality simply means that you don't obliterate things, right? That you have a responsibility to be, sorry to say it, surgical.
You use the force necessary to accomplish your goals.
You use the force necessary to accomplish the goal. So just as a matter of who struggled with this and answered it, maybe rightly or wrongly, the first George Bush, right? Should we, right at the start, go right into Iraq and take over, right? We did Kuwait, we're right on the border. We could kind of finish this, so to say, right? But he decided not to, out of this concept, partially out of this concept of proportionality. Do you, just because you're already in Kuwait, does that give you permission to then plow forward and use force in another way, another level?
He was
if you will?
Episcopalian.
He wasn't Episcopalian. Sarah.
Sort of leads to a question I've had since we started, which was the idea of defending yourself.
Yeah,
But what about the situation in which you see the attack on someone else?
right.
Is it then okay for you to come in to try to assist in that situation? And I'm thinking of a criminal thing years ago.
Yeah,
in
yeah.
New York.
Well, sure, if you decide, but if you decide to do that,
But yeah,
then you're saying to yourself, every situation in which that happens, that's how I believe that defense
right. And
is-
that can translate.
is okay. But Sarah's bringing up a point that some pacifists, I think this is, what's the phrase to use? Anyway, it's not coming to my mind, but slicing things in the wrong direction, so to say, will say, I won't defend myself, but I'll defend other people.
Well, or even
I'll
defending
use-
myself, I will still defend someone else.
Yeah, yeah, but you see the complexity of it. I think that that's kind of doesn't work. Personally, I don't think that works, but nevertheless.
But isn't that part of the argument right now of those who think that maybe we should be going into and getting more into?
I'm sure it is.
Or-
I'm sure it is. And we have a history as a nation, right? We entered World War II, partly because, an entire Europe run by one country would eventually be able to get across the Atlantic, right? But also we had a belief that it was right to defend what was people for what was going on in Europe. I mean, we can always have entire classes on the strategies of each individual war, but yeah, other questions, yeah,
Well,
Liz.
because you never said it here.
Yeah,
But to me, the elephant in the room, so to speak, is turn the other cheek.
right,
And, that I'm sure all of us have in mind, because that goes back to the question of, well, what is that? What are we to do? And
Right.
Jesus said this,
right.
and what did he mean?
Right, we're gonna look at that in a minute. Yeah, other questions, comments, perspectives, yeah,
When you're talking the analogy of the individual and then this larger society,
yeah,
anyone who has ever been tyrannized by a bully,
yeah,
who is in fact a small-time sociopath,
right,
there are international sociopaths.
amen. Yeah,
And we used to say in policy statements, the state has a monopoly on violence.
Yeah.
Means the local level, that is law enforcement.
Yeah.
At larger levels, that is the military.
right,
And the question is then, what are your rights as an individual? You're talking about self-defense, except, and a lawyer could probably deal with this better than I. There are very stringent criteria on what self-defense constitutes.
sure, absolutely, and
In
that's
other
kind of,
words, you're supposed to sit and wait for the police to come and protect you.
yeah,
Except
Right.
Doesn't always work.
Right, we could certainly go down that road of the current like legal system's perspective on self-defense. Here, I think what we're doing is simply, recognizing as a statement of faith, as an understanding of our own faith, what do I personally believe about my own defense and the defense of those that I love and care for? And if one comes to a conclusion that there are situations where I'm willing to use force in whatever form that might mean, and sometimes maybe that force is harmful and or deadly to the other individual to protect myself, then it is hard to claim that the state should not be doing that either in any way, shape, or form. There are many Christian communities, or a number of Christian communities like the Mennonites who believe that. I mean, there are pacifist Christian sect. I use the word sect in a positive way, not in a negative way. A pacifist Christian sect that it's all very clear in all of their theology and writings that you are even not to defend yourself. Do not use violence in any way. That this is, and we're going to get into the biblical passages in this class. But yeah, Peter.
Just the name reverberating in me is Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Right, right. So there you have another perfect example to remind everyone. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German theologian and Christian who, in his early writings, speaks this way of pacifism, and yet now captured in a concentration camp, considering the millions of people that are being indiscriminately slaughtered, decides it is right to participate in a plot to assassinate Hitler for murder. And right now, every single one of us in our brain can be thinking, do we agree with that or do we not agree with that? And what I am suggesting is if you agree with that, then you're not a pacifist. I mean, you don't have to be a warmonger, right? You do not have to be a warmonger, and you can claim all of the ways in which everyone should do everything they can to avoid violence, but you're not a pacifist in its pure understanding, right? Because if this is okay, then you've accepted in yourself somehow that it is okay to defend others and or myself. See how this is a deeply challenging aspect of belief, of faith, of following Jesus. Yeah, Sarah.
It's also it's easier to agree with this on one philosophical level than
Yeah.
it is you start to deal with personal situations.
Yes, it is. It is. And yet I do think it's important to do both.
Yeah.
Because it's very hard to come to different conclusions. Now,
I was just thinking, as an ordinary citizen, nothing special, so I think you're so shocked and abhor the violence such as in Ukraine or
Yeah.
indiscriminate. And yet, I think over my life, I probably I chose to avoid issue of is this any way my opinions in conflict with my faith.
Yeah.
I think the organization, it's easier just not to deal with it.
that's correct.
Because I don't know how to deal with it,
Yeah.
and yet I'm so horrible about to watch some of this in war in general.
Yeah.
But if I feel it is for a just cause, then I'll just ignore my faith in this. I'm just saying on a daily basis, I can't resolve it in my own mind,
Yeah.
so therefore I just don't deal with it.
Yeah. So thank you, Mac. I think that we're, it's important to have some struggle with this, and as we sit there and think about situations in the world, how we're answering that as a disciple of Jesus. And I'm about to suggest to you that we may answer this question as a disciple of Jesus with these theories of just war. I mean, the just war kind of perspective came out of Christianity, and many or Judeo-Christian kind of struggle with this way of being and struggle with war. And we can think of so many situations just in our lifetime. I mean, I have not lived through a world war, or I mean, my grandfather was in World War II. One grandfather was served in the army. My other grandfather, they wouldn't let him go because he was a welder at the Navy base, and they needed him. They needed him there to keep on being a welder. And we can think of 9/11, right? But that's my closest kind of experience of personal national attack, or as it is for some people in the room. So we can think of just so many different situations. And so it's important for us to have a concept of how we deal with this and think about it. Yeah, that's okay. Liz?
Well, I just also think in other religions, then our just war may be in conflict with like the Islamic word
That's
or
correct.
Arabic word jihad, which
Right.
means the holy war, which is like a just war.
Right,
And of course, in Judaism,
right,
and I'm sure others.
right, absolutely, yeah.
Interesting you should mention 9/11.
Yeah.
Because the response of our national authorities to that was not to deal with the real perpetrators, but to look for some excuse to get someone, which is how we got into the mess in the Middle East.
Yeah, fascinating.
And as you said, the elder Bush said, enough is enough. We're going to leave Saddam Hussein because he is a useful makeweight against Iran.
Yeah.
So Cheney and the chicken hawks who were advising the younger Bush took Saddam Hussein out, and we got the situation in Iraq. You broke it, you own it.
Yeah. Thank you. So you can see the again, just the complexity. Yeah, Matt.
I went to Vietnam, and I remember it when you think about this, my father said to me, you will go to Vietnam
Yeah.
because your country, your government has said so.
Yeah.
And I accepted it. I was going to run off to Canada.
Yeah.
You think, but I didn't spend a lot of time questioning. But I remember how horrified I was afterwards when McNamara's thing, and they came out, the discussion that had gone on about
Yeah.
the law.
Yeah.
I thought, I criticize those who criticize. And yet, when you see how really it challenges, I mean, I was sort of horrified afterwards to think that I had been so accepting of the state. Yeah, that's where I am, I'm sure.
I think what everyone's pointing out is another dynamic that's mixing in with us today in 2022 is, and I actually think this is true, then what we're watching in Ukraine right now is horrifying to us because it's old time war.
Yeah.
Old time war. Whereas most nation states today aren't really considering old time war. They're working in every other way. Cyber attacks, right? Terrorism, secret terrorism. And so the nature of the conflicts is, I don't know, maybe this is wanting to think of the modern as special, but nevertheless, the nature of the conflicts are radically different than even 50 years ago, right? And so one of the things that kind of perplexes, I think, all of us about what's going on in Ukraine is not just the absurdity of it, but also the kind of like, who would do this? Who would do old time war today?
Physical violence.
Right, the physical violence, but also tanks and, who would do this today, right? With nuclear weapons and I mean, thank God that we have, I mean, I know I'm speaking, I can't speak for us generally, but my perspective is, thank God that we as a nation have a belief that it would be unproportional for us to use nuclear weapons right now, because we could. We could stop this in a heartbeat, right?
Scott,
Or grow it, right? No, that's why the United States, as has been stated, has not done what it could do and just prevent this from happening because of the fear that, you know, the ballistic missiles will be coming out of Russia over to our own shores. I mean, this is, yeah. Okay, online, someone was
Yes.
speaking.
it was me. It's bad. Hey, so I think I grew up in the same time period you did, but one thing that affected me was both the Cold War, but also growing up being told about World War II was a very just war because of Hitler and all of the, you know, the films we saw, all of that. And it seems similar to Ukraine, but then I think about, why don't we do anything about civil wars or war atrocities in, say, like Africa? It seems like, I don't know why we would react like this is, you know, when we say never again after the Holocaust, it's like, of course, but why don't we react the same way if it's in South America, if it's in Africa? And I don't have the answers to that. I just know that that troubles me.
Yeah, thank you, Beth. So Beth is pointing out that, you know, we've been adding into our conversation incidents that are obvious to us. But we should not be surprised that atrocities are happening around the world all of the time. And here is the struggle of
That the US is engaged.
that the US is engaged in, right? So, or you know, many of you know about the horrible genocide in Rwanda many years ago now, you know, ignored, right? Ignored. And that's another this is the side, largely we have been a nation that has practiced this war is for defense and enforcing peace, right? And that has been, as a nation, largely how we have seen our national defense. Yeah, Peter.
Yeah, but dare I bring up racism and cultural disparities enormously different.
Sure.
So when we're watching, I started to say newsreels, so I don't think they have those anymore.
Yeah.
But when we're watching buildings that look like our own in Kiev, you know, so we immediately identify with all those, for the most part, Caucasians
Right,
who are fleeing the burning building.
right.
And we have a hard time with the dark folks coming out of a book. So
Yeah, so there's a piece of, you know, we are immediately have a great deal of sympathy for other cultures that look like ours.
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem anyway, as we have as much sympathy for cultures that don't necessarily look like ours, right? Apartheid reigned in South Africa for many years, and we were very, very comfortable with that. And even though the conditions of most of the population were as equally as horrid, the daily conditions of life.
For the welcoming
Yeah.
Ukrainian refugees, but we forgot the Afghan.
Yes, welcoming Ukrainian refugees, but, you know, I'm not sure I want to help an Afghan refugee. Yeah.
As a student of American history, I can think of the two notable exceptions. One was the Mexican War and the other was the Spanish-American War,
Mhm.
which were not at all for self-defense.
Uh-huh.
And of course, the
Okay, yes.
genocide
Thank you.
against Native Americans.
Right, yes, thank you for that. Yes, thank you. So we're not, yeah. I appreciate that. I appreciate that. We've got a few minutes here. Let's pick up our Bibles. Yes, Episcopalians picking up the Bible. Right, right.
The Bible says,
Right. Nevertheless, we should be acquainted. That's right. We should be acquainted. And actually, I'm going to grab one of these because I know my kind. And when I find this passage, I'm going to have to give you the page number. No shame. I get it. I get it. All right. So I'm turning to the prophet Isaiah, chapter 10. And that will be found in your Bible, unless you brought your own, 626, page 626. So for those who, support war, here are some support the criteria for just war. Here are some biblical passages. I don't know if we'll get to the ones I want to get to today, but Isaiah 10, 1 through 11. Ah, you who make iniquitous decrees, who write oppressive statutes, to turn aside the needy from justice, and to rob the poor of my people in their right, that widows may be your spoil, and that you may make the orphans your prey. What will you do on the day of punishment, in the calamity that will come from far away? To whom will you flee for help, and where will you leave your wealth, so as not to crouch among the prisoners or fall among the slain? For all this, his anger has not turned away. His hand is stretched out still. Ah, Assyria, the rod of my anger, the club in their hands is my fury. Against a godless nation I send him, and against the people of my wrath I command him, to take spoil and seize plunder, and to tread them down like the mire of the streets. But this is not what he intends, nor does he have this in mind, but it is in his heart to destroy and to cut off nations, not a few. So this is the prophet Isaiah. There's the cultural context going on, but acknowledging the way in which they have been oppressed as a people. It's kind of like this is the way nations act, you shouldn't be surprised by it. So we are surprised when a nation really does seem peaceful, right? We are surprised when a nation seems peaceful. Let's look at in the New Testament, in the letter to James.
There's one line in there that I want to draw attention to.
Go right ahead.
Ah, Assyria, the rod of my anger.
Yeah,
And this, of course, refers back to Kings, doesn't it?
it does. Yes,
Yes.
yes. We could spend quite a bit of time on the cultural background of the passage.
And how they may apply to today.
Yeah, we could. James. 11 what? 1100. All right. Chapter 4, page 1102. 1102. Those conflicts and disputes among you, where do they come from? Do they not come from your cravings that are at war within you? You want something and do not have it, so you commit murder. And you covet something and cannot obtain it, so you engage in disputes and conflicts. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and you do not receive because you ask wrongly in order to spend what you get on your pleasures. adulterers. Do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world becomes an enemy of God. Or do you suppose that it is for nothing that the scripture says, God yearns jealously for the spirit that he has made to dwell in us, but he gives all the more grace. Therefore, it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble, right? So this aspect here of, in this passage anyway, of the conflict of what is it that brings up our desire to, for a war, in a sense, right? I'm going to read, you don't have to go to it, let me read another passage. I'm going to Romans 13, which is on page 1034. Page 1034. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, chapter 13:1. For there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Do you wish to have no fear of the authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive its approval. For it is God's servant for your good. But if you do what is wrong, you should be afraid, for the authority does not bear the sword in vain. It is the servant of God to execute wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be subject, not only because of wrath, but also because of conscience. For the same reason, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants, busy with this very thing. Pay to all what is due them, taxes to whom taxes are due, revenue to whom revenue is due, respect to whom respect is due, honor to whom honor is due. And then we'll get the passage on love right after this. So there's a lot to unpack here, but you can see why Christians have a complex relationship here in terms of the church and the state. Every religion has this present. Every religion has this present. And there has been time in Christian history where we have looked like what we might say the Islamic world looks like today, where there is not to be in a perfect situation, a separation between church and state. There is no largely Islamic country in this world, that has separation of church and state. Theoretically, Turkey does, but in the past 10 to 15 years, that has been deeply eroded. It was, for many years, the only Islamic state that valued a separation of church and state, and that has been eroded and degraded over the past 20 years, I think it is now. Peter?
Yeah, I just wonder if it's even remotely possible to separate church and state.
Well, that's a very good question, because we don't seem to have completely accomplished it
No,
either.
yeah.
However, I think that's another, we're not going to do that in this class. But
Sorry.
we could have a class on whether or not the founders of our own nation intended a type of separation of church and state that modern day perspectives think they did. I mean, that would be a good discussion and class.
Are we less a Christian if we don't deal with it?
That's between you and God. Well, here, what I would say is that there, we're not gonna come away from this class necessarily knowing what the answer is.
No, I know.
Each one of us is going to have a sense of how we look at this concept of when is it right to defend oneself, defend one's loved ones, and then ultimately what situation would be right for my nation to defend itself and or enforce peace, to use the phrase of the early church fathers, And theoretically, that's how we understood World War II, that we were going in, we were going in to enforce a peace, right? And that's, I think, largely, Jace has pointed out a couple of situations where it doesn't necessarily apply, but largely that has been how our nation has engaged in war.
But we initially took it on finally at total defense.
Right.
Because of Pearl Harbor, and then we.
Because we had been attacked first.
Right, and
Yes.
then we jumped in
Yes,
to
which
then
is
say,
another-
okay, now we're gonna help in Europe finally, but that was
Yes,
such a long
yeah,
debate.
which is another concept of just war theory, that you do have, it has to be defensive. That you have to be defending yourself.
And there was a very strong non-interventionist
Very
movement in
much.
the US right up until Pearl Harbor.
Right, absolutely. Where would we be today? Yeah. Has anybody ever seen the TV program called Man in the High Castle? It envisions that Germany won. And the entire United States was taken over. The Eastern Board by Germany, the Western Board by Japan. It's a fascinating Man in the High Castle.
I think
It's a drama, so it's not intent, it's fiction, and it's a drama.
What's it on?
I don't know, I think it's on Amazon, I can't.
I think the book, was by Philip Dick.
Yeah, okay, there's a book on it, Man in the High Castle, but it's surreal.
Yeah.
To watch, because it's possible.
Alternative history.
Yeah, it's possible to have happened.
Robert Harris also has written a couple of books about, well, there's a whole genre of counterfactual history.
Is there? Yeah. That's kind of probably the first one I've really engaged with, so,
One minute, one quick thing.
all right, I'm gonna need to go.
Okay, no, but we're talking about what got us into World War II.
Yeah,
But it seems to me if we look at that whole aspect, then we look at what we as a nation did to Europe after we won and went in and helped them rebuild. So that's adds another complexity to
Yeah.
what we were doing. and
Yeah.
why we did it.
it sure does. Thank you. We're gonna continue next week. We're gonna look a little bit more at some biblical passages about this, and we're gonna go deeper into a couple of examples and complexities of living out this tension that we do have. Thank you. All right, let's.
Thank you.